Welcome to the Grow Podcast. I'm Pastor Mike with New Hope Network. We're here to help you take your next step in your relationship with Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Grow Podcast. Hello, Pastor Mike.
Hello, Hattie.
Yes, I'm Hattie. I'm not David, if you guys cannot tell who are joining us today.
You are not David.
Yeah, a little different size.
Yes.
Different sounding voice.
Yes.
Yeah, a little bit different today.
Yeah. Hopefully more pleasant. I'm just saying that, wow, he's not here to defend himself.
Yeah.
That's
my
nice
one goal of getting to host the podcast today is just to be a little bit more pleasant than David.
And for those that don't know Hattie's role, your role around New Hope is
discipleship things.
Which is like this is like the perfect fit for you to be in the podcast.
Sure. You know, just when I do new things, I get a little bit nervous. So instead of saying podcast, I said padcast.
The first take, yeah, when we were in it.
Yep.
But you were on New Hope here on our online campus in the lobby a lot for that, and then teach a lot in our discipleship journey classes.
Yeah, I enjoy all those
stage.
things. Maybe the more we do the podcast,
and we're going to have you teaching more online, like preaching and teaching more.
Maybe.
I know.
We'll see. We'll see.
Hattie always looks at me like, I'm not sure I want to do that. But
yeah, I feel like the first time I taught online, I should have done a few more things, like maybe accidentally tipped over the table, like spilled my coffee.
So that you wouldn't have to do
exactly.
it again?
Yep.
Yeah.
Next time, though.
We'll have you teach in this series, in the Greatest Story Ever Told
which
series.
is a very long series. So at
there's
some
a lot
point in there.
A lot of chance, a lot of opportunity for us to do that. So what episode are we today?
Oh, yes. I almost forgot. We are episode 67 of the podcast.
67.
That's a lot of episodes.
It is. It's been good.
It's been really good.
David's not here, so we both feel a bit lost. David's under the weather, so we're trying to wander through this.
Ooh.
And
that was a good.
You
that
like
was
this?
Yeah, that was
feel
a good.
A bit lost,
plug.
wander through this. You like that?
Yeah.
So if you haven't, make sure you subscribe to wherever you consume this content and hit the like button, get notifications so you know when the new ones come out. We're actually working. I don't know that you know this. We're working on, in October, we're going to have a bonus episode on top of the ones that are coming out. So you want to have your notifications enabled to remind you. And we'll have a special guest on, someone who's been on the podcast before, someone from a friend of ours from another church is going to be here and help us.
I haven't heard
one.
this. Are you like going to give people a hint on who it is? Maybe they could guess.
Not yet.
Or get them more excited.
Yeah.
Okay, it's top secret.
It's top secret right now, but it's a pastor friend of mine who might be related to David. Is that a clue?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
A little bit of a clue, but still not positive on who that might be. Okay,
good.
That'll be good. That'll be really good.
You don't wander into weird conversations as often as David. I have no idea how we get into some of the topics that David gets us into at the top, and we always have to figure out how to bring it back to our topic.
That's not really my sweet spot, unless I feel like we're on the lobby, and then I am pretty good about getting us off the rails. This one feels like it's more focused, so I have to be a little bit more focused.
I feel like it's David or Olivia that typically get you off in the lobby, and you just kind of follow.
Maybe that's true.
You introduce whatever the baked good month is going to be.
And that's always my favorite,
yeah.
Like pumpkin month this week. If you didn't watch the lobby, pumpkin week.
Pumpkin month this week.
That's what I meant to say. Pumpkin week. I was really rooting for pumpkin month, but
there were some good things. I sampled
some
of those things.
Yeah, pretty tasty. I could eat pumpkin baked goods every day.
So, where are we going today?
Yeah, so this past week, yesterday, you taught us about Moses, but you taught us his whole story, so I'm not really sure what else you have left to cover in today's podcast.
Well, we only had like 35 minutes to talk about him, and he was, Moses trivia. How old was Moses? How
this
long?
Is like you're really asking me?
Yeah, I'm really asking you.
I am going to say 696.
No, not even close. But
was that how old Methuselah was?
Methuselah was in his 900s.
I think that was 960.
So Moses, and we talked about this on the week. You can kind of divide Moses' life into three parts, and it's 40, 40, 40. So 40 plus 40 plus 40. There's math. Math is hard.
Math is challenging.
120 is
I
how
actually
long
do
he lived.
remember the 40, 40, and 40, but
just didn't do the math.
Well, it seemed too perfect that would actually be how old he actually was.
Yeah, that's basically from what we know. So the first 40 years were his years of growing up and preparation, education. Second 40 years were years in the desert. So God prepared him 80 years for 40 years of leadership.
It's a long time of preparation.
There's probably a principle there. We want to rush into whatever we're supposed to do, and God wants to prepare us for it. That we could probably teach on that.
I think a lot of us probably would prefer the rushing instead of the very long season of preparation.
So, what should we talk about the 10 plagues? Is that
I was looking through some of the notes, and there are some really interesting names that I'm very excited to hear you say, names of the different gods that we're going to talk about. And I have no idea if you would say them correctly or not.
I don't either. We're going to make it up as we go.
I'm very excited about that.
So one of the things that we referred to real quickly over the weekend was this moment. And if you've ever watched, have you ever seen the classic movie about this with Charlton Heston, The 10 Commandments? Have you ever seen that movie?
I don't think so, no.
Yeah, I wonder if you can actually get that on Netflix or Producer. Can we get that on Netflix or any place? You know what I'm talking about? It's called The 10 Commandments. Charlton Heston. Do you guys know who that is? Am I dating myself?
I think you are dating yourself.
Put it in the comments if you know who that is. There's probably...
But The Prince of Egypt now, that's a great movie.
Yes.
Probably a little after.
Probably a little after that. But that's most of us. That's kind of our familiarity with Moses and Moses' life. But there's, and Exodus talks about when Moses goes back to ask Pharaoh, who we don't always connect, but those movies actually do a good job of reminding us. Moses actually most likely grew up with him, alongside of him, and so he asks him to release the slaves, which was the economic backbone of the country.
Hey bro, could you just please release all of the slaves?
Just ruin your economy.
I'm not asking for much.
Because God says, and you don't know who God is. So you kind of get a picture of some of that. And then we see these 10 plagues, which sound crazy and science fiction and all these kinds of things, and it just feels like, as you read through it, God is going, just look how big and powerful I am, which is, there's part of that, but God always has a purpose. And each one of these, each one of the plagues was aimed at a very specific Egyptian god in their pantheon, multiple gods. And basically, for Egypt and for Israel, God was dismantling their belief system, dismantling their worldview. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about in the coming weeks, not only the next 2 weeks of Threads as we wind up the first 6 weeks here.
Which I am already sad that it's coming into an end because it's been so good.
And then we move into Promised Land, so we're still talking about that. And I'm just, in fact, right now writing, putting together, and studying for that series as we move into that. But the whole kind of first 12 weeks of this, so the first several hundred years of Israel coming out of Egypt. God took them out of Egypt, but now he's trying to get Egypt out of them. Because there's a whole worldview. It's kind of like, okay, which God, what God? Because everything in that culture, we don't understand this, everything in that culture was related to some God, little g. So each one of these 10 plagues, they got increasingly worse, increasingly devastating, and increasingly crazy, was aimed at one of the Egyptian gods. And if you look at them in the pantheon, it goes from the weakest of them, the most limited of them, to the most powerful of them as you move through. So the first plague, quiz, what was the first plague?
I should know this. Because I might have looked at your notes before the podcast. You're putting me on the spot, Pastor Mike. I'm going to say
Cheater.
Water into blood.
Yeah, and this is one of the guys. I don't exactly know how to pronounce this god's name.
But let's hear you try it.
I believe it's Hapai.
Okay.
I about said happy because it's kind of spelled happy.
Yeah, it kind of looks like happy.
And this was the god of the Nile, the one who provides water. And this god was very important to the Egyptians because, this is the Nile River Delta. One of the reasons Egypt has been so powerful and so influential in that region was because of the Nile. Okay. Water matters in the Middle East, to water the crops, for transportation, all those kinds of things. So this was a very powerful God in their pantheon. but it was the God who kind of provided the resources for everything. And it's interesting, there was a 7-day period, and 7 in Scripture is a significant number. It means completion. It means this is a complete process, a complete thought. So part of what you read here is God is the provider of resource. He's the provider of life. The Nile was the source of life for them. This is where our water comes from. This is where we wash. This is where we clean. This is how we water our crops. This is how we transport our goods. This is how we get from one place to another in the country. And basically, when God said this is happening for 7 days, it's I have complete power over life. So, and that's a foreshadowing, obviously, of what happens in the 10th plague. When we get to the Passover. So that was the first one. The second one is probably, to me, one of the 2 grossest of this whole thing.
I was going to ask, of all of these, which some of them, as you will say, we go on, they get worse and worse. But maybe some of these first ones. Which one?
The plague of frogs. I just can't imagine. So it said frogs were in everything. Everywhere you went. Yeah. Could you imagine going to bed at night and there's frogs hopping around?
Or in your cup of tea right now.
Yeah.
It would also be very loud, I would imagine.
Yeah. So you probably wouldn't be able to rest. And this was aimed, so there was a goddess named Heken, and she was the goddess of fertility, and of water, and of renewal. So renewal, life. But it was interesting the way that she was always drawn. She was always drawn with the head of a frog. And I'm sure there's more significance there than what I was able to dig out. But this was very much aimed at fertility. You can't control the production, the multiplication. I mean, I'm going to put frogs in everything. And again, life is a key thread that comes through. I am the God of life. Without her, new life wasn't possible. But because frogs were now in everything, it just inhibited everything. No way for life. And it's interesting with these first 2 plagues, Pharaoh's magicians could reproduce them, which, I'm sure they were going, well, we've got the same power, but they couldn't stop them.
Sure. I would love, I've seen The Prince of Egypt, and it's so good. You can kind of imagine water turning into blood, and we know God can do that, but I'd be really curious, just how did the magicians go about doing this?
Yeah. Whether it was a trick, because there is supernatural power. Was there something? But is like, can you imagine with the Pharaoh, his magicians come forward and say, we've got the same power. Yeah. And what do? They produce more of the mess.
Yeah, good way to go.
Wait, let's go the other way. Yeah. No, we can't do that. We can produce more. We're okay. We've got enough frogs. So the third one, this was aimed at the god Geb, or the god of the earth, and this might be the grossest.
I think this one's the grossest because you can't really see it.
Yeah, and the lice came out of the dust, came out of the earth. That's why it was aimed at Geb. And there's a thread here because we're on threads. There's a thread here. We go all the way back to Genesis. How did God create us? He created us out of the dust, or at least man he created out of the dust. And now the very dust that we were created from was part of the plague. So there's a reminder that what God originally created, now sin is twisting, and there's a devastation from that. And you imagine, as we walk through these, what this was doing to Pharaoh's power base. He was the one who was considered to be, as we'll get to, the son of Ra. He was supposed to have he was supposed to be the voice of the gods. He spoke for the gods. He was able to commune with the gods, and the gods weren't listening to him. And yet they were listening to this other guy, Moses, and his mouthpiece. So his power base was beginning to crumble.
It makes me wonder, at that point, it took so long for him to really give up. How did he even make it past the lice one, or the lice plague?
You gotta wonder, but and here's I mean, this is a repeating thread. Think how we do. We want God to help us, and we want God to help us, and we promise, and we probably all prayed those prayers. Mm-hmm. God, if you do, then I will.
Yeah.
And then when God actually does something, how long until we revert to our old ways?
That's so true.
And so there's some of that's very much revealing of our nature in this. The fourth one, the swarm of flies. Okay, these last three I think are the grossest. You've got lice, you've got flies, you've got frogs. And this was aimed at Capri, who was the god of creation. Capri was the god, not she, he. Oversaw the movement of the sun and rebirth, had the head of a fly. That's a great god to worship, right?
That's hilarious to me. Why would you worship? Flies are so gross and small and insignificant.
Yeah. And yet, think about where they lived in the ancient world. Flies were a major part of life. And so it's like, why are there so many of this kind of bug? So they came up with explanations for this. And this one is interesting because this is the first plague that began to show us separation. The first three plagues affected everyone, all of Egypt. But with this one, only the Egyptians were bugged. So imagine, you're one of the Israelite slaves. You're working. Yeah, bugged. I missed
they
that.
They got bugged.
Yeah. You guys caught that. I didn't catch that.
That was it. You're cracking jokes and you don't even know it, Pastor Mike.
So imagine you're one of the slaves. You're walking down, and slaves, it's like you've got a bubble around you. None of the flies are around you.
I'd really be questioning, like, what did I do wrong in life that I have flies swarming me?
Yeah. And now, if you note at this point in time, Pharaoh's starting to recognize, oh, my gods aren't as powerful as your God. But he's treating God. So this is part of God dismantling their worldview. So he begins to treat Moses' God as one of his gods. I can bargain with him. Because that's how they saw gods as more powerful. They saw gods as beings they couldn't fully understand, but they saw gods as beings individual that they could bargain with, which is always false religion. And people have turned Christianity into this too. If I do this, my list of things, then I prove myself. So it's kind of a bargain.
I've been guilty of that plenty of times. Yeah.
And then there's whole even Christianity cults, and this will bother some people, but the Latter-day Saints, Jehovah's Witnesses, but especially like the Latter-day Saints, once you come into a certain age, you actually make a series of vows or commitments, and it's basically saying, this is how I'm going to perform to prove myself. It's always the sign of a false religion, a man-made religion. And God wants to dismantle that for us. Because why? Because we constantly think we can bargain. And this goes all the way back to the garden. Adam and Eve didn't like the limits that were placed on them, so they ate their fruit. They bought into the lie. Why? That they could be like God. And so part of what bargaining is we bring God down to our level. Instead of us being like him, we're going to bring him down to our level. And we do that over and over.
Pastor Mike is preaching today on the podcast, everybody.
Yeah. So, we've got to move on through these. So number 5, death of cattle and livestock. This is aimed at the goddess Hathor, the goddess of love and protection. Often she was drawn as a woman, sometimes a woman with the head of a cow. I'm not sure how flattering that was.
I don't really like this one very much.
And this is the first one that had a warning of when it would happen. In other words, they gave Pharaoh an opportunity. You can repent before this happens. It's going to happen tomorrow, so you can come back. But this one affected the economy. The others were gross, they were awful, but life was able at least to move forward. This one affected, think about this, transportation, when livestock was dead. This one affected the military, because the military moved on the backs of livestock. This one affected supplies, farming, clothing. Where did leather come from?
Sure.
Now
it shut everything down.
It just began to shut everything down. And so, again, it gets worse and worse. Number 6 was boils and sores, and this was aimed at Isis, the goddess of medicine and the goddess of peace. Isn't that ironic? She's the goddess of peace, and you're constantly in pain, so you have anything but peace. And this one came unannounced. It just came, and it attacked the Egyptians, not their economy, personally.
Okay.
Now it's their body.
And this was just Egyptians.
Yeah,
okay.
Only them. But this one also meant that they couldn't engage in the worship of their gods, because they were not allowed to worship and go into the temples if they were unclean, if they had open sores. So, and this would have affected Pharaoh. No one was allowed to stand in Pharaoh's presence if they were sick or had open sores. So this robbed him of all of his advisors. This robbed him of his military leaders. And Moses and Aaron were the only ones who could stand in Pharaoh's presence.
Because they didn't have it. Doesn't that just make you so thankful that we don't have to do anything to approach God or be a certain way? We can have sores and boils, although I hope none of us have sores and boils.
Yeah. But there's, we say, well, these were pretty awful. These were ruthless. And they were. But here's the other thing. You notice what happens. There's sometimes God will allow something that will move us in a direction we would not have gone otherwise. So God actually separates the people from their worship. Why? So that they might turn to Him. And sometimes that's what He needs to happen to us. Is He's got have happened to us. He's got to separate us from whatever is distracting us and worshiping us. Does He cause it? Not always. Sometimes He allows it though for that. Then we get down to the last few here. So hail came that killed, and I love this goddess's name, Nut.
I was wondering if it was going to be like Newt.
Yeah,
it couldn't be as simple as just Nut.
I don't speak Egyptian, so this was the goddess of the sky. So this basically was the god was attacking goddess. The sky was attacking them. And the gods being attacked as we move forward are increasing the power of the Egyptian pantheon. Another warning is given, and this time the Egyptians, the people, they're given the opportunity to escape it. If you believe this is going to happen, then stay inside. Bring your cattle, bring everything inside, and to escape. Basically to acknowledge that God is God. The God is God. Now, what's interesting is that there are specific crops that were mentioned here. Flax and barley were hailed out here. The food crops probably hadn't sprung up yet as much. But flax and barley were not primarily food crops for ancient Egypt, but they were used for clothing and for idol worship. See what God is doing? He's trying to remove their worship of false idols. The wheat still survived, we find out later.
Do you think they understood this at the time, or do you think it took them a while to realize, or do we see it later?
I think we see it more clearly, but at the time, I mean, there would have been a clear, oh, wait, that part of our life was just devastated. But again, you see, like Pharaoh coming back, but our food's still here.
Yeah.
We can recover from this. Our food's still here until number 8, the locusts come. And this was attacked the god of Seth, the god of storms, the god of chaos. Locusts, would have attacked that directly. And this one was declared to affect more than the present, but this one also would affect future generations, because this one wiped out their food source and all vegetation. So it's not just that this year's crop, but next year's seeds. And this one would have been a multi-year effect. This one would have affected them for generations. And the foreshadowing here is death is coming. Unless you change, death is coming.
But still.
Yeah. Number 9 was darkness for 3 days. Think there's anything significant there?
Yeah, I would guess that there probably is. Sounds
How
familiar.
long was Jesus in the ground?
It was 3 days.
3 days.
Yeah.
There's a foreshadowing. And this one attacked, Ra was considered the chief of the gods, the god of the sun. So Ra, Seth, and Anubis were considered the 3 greatest rivals, and these were the 3 that were really attacked here. This one, more than anything, would have just had a psychological impact. It would have had a religious impact. Darkness was something to be afraid of. It meant death. It meant hopelessness. And this wasn't just that it was night. It was complete absence of light is what we read.
And, thinking about everything that they had just experienced and then to be in complete darkness for 3 days. Yeah, that would just be awful.
But again, God could have done so much worse or allowed so much worse. What does darkness do? It's a psychological impact. But you've got 3 days. Remember, he's been separating them from their gods. 3 days now of solitude.
Sure.
To think about, and even Pharaoh to think about it. And then, of course, the last one, we know is the Passover, which, is ultimately remembered every year by the Jewish people. But this was the death of their future. So the death of the firstborn, the one who was to inherit everything, the one who was to manage and take care of the family. And part of this was Pharaoh was considered to be the son of Ra, and only Anubis, the god of death, might challenge Ra. And so Pharaoh's son died. So here he was not only supposedly in direct contact with a god, the chief of the gods, and was the son of the gods, but his own son died. That wasn't ever supposed to happen. And death came not though for him, but for his firstborn, for his future. And this just reveals so much of the Lord's heart. We go, why would God be this harsh? God did not want this. He didn't want this. He gave them every opportunity to avoid this. And it's so interesting, in some of the, you go back and read some of the earlier plagues, Moses, Pharaoh would say, no, not going to happen. Moses would say, here's what's going to happen. And he even once or twice gave Pharaoh the opportunity. Okay, when do you want it to happen? And can you imagine? It's like, if that's going to happen, let's have it happen tomorrow. My calendar.
Yeah.
And it's like, why not just choose for it not to happen?
So there were 9 other opportunities to not get to this point. Yeah.
But here's the thread that constantly, even in the worst of the worst, in death, God offers hope, God offers a way out, and his thread weaves in. It's a looking forward to the Passover we talked a little bit about this over the weekend. The blood, the kafar is the Hebrew word here, was on the doorposts, and it meant you are to pass over. It's the same word that was used all the way back in Genesis when God killed the first animal to cover the nakedness and shame of Adam and Eve. He covered their sin. It's the same word that's used for, we'll find out later, when they build the Ark of the Covenant for the Seed of Atonement. There's a covering on it. It was called the kafar, and that's where every year the high priest would go in after killing the Lamb of Atonement and put the blood on it that would cover the sins of God's people. And so it's pointing towards God will cover the sins. God covers the sins until Jesus comes. The kafar stops, and it's no longer a covering. It's payment.
That's fascinating.
It's payment for us.
One thing I was wondering, we know that numbers are significant in the Bible. There are 10 plagues. Why 10?
Yeah. A lot of scholars believe, that 10 was repeated. It's similar to 7 in that it indicates completion. But especially when it comes to the work of something, it means we had to go through a whole process. But here's what's fascinating. And again, God leaves nothing to chance. There were 10 plagues. All of Israel would have been witness to this. Anybody remember what the primary laws were given to them? How many laws, the primary ones that were given them on Mount Sinai? There were 10 commandments. So this was the core. And it's basically saying God is the source of life. This is the source. This is everything, encompasses everything. And even though, as we'll discover next week when we look at the laws, there were 613 other laws on top of the 10 commandments. If you look at the core of law, if you follow the 10, the others all fall into place. And that's part of his saying. This is part of how we discover who God is. So, no, I don't know. David normally at the end goes, all right, how are we going to bring all this in for
what a great question
that's a great question.
Asked yourself, Pastor Mike. You should consider hosting the podcast more often.
So it's all good. But if we look at what was happening here, the ancient world viewed the gods as the ones who controlled the various parts of life. God introduces himself as I am. You don't control the various parts of life. I am that I am. But what do? We increasingly want to try and control the various parts of our life.
Yeah.
Fast forward to the Sermon on the Mount. And what does Jesus do? He begins to systematically dismantle the ways that we control our life. Things like anger, that's part of how we try and control. Things like greed and lust and judgmentalism. Why do we get caught in judging others? Because they don't act the way that we think they should act. So this is important because it's a reminder that sin has given us all the worldview that God wants to dismantle. And so God's hope and his desire is that we would say yes to him. But he's willing to go to great lengths to dismantle our sinful perspective and worldview, and sometimes allow some pain. And here's the deal. Not because he's angry with us, but because he loves us so much. He doesn't want us to get stuck there.
That's good.
So the challenge for this week is, if you've got the storybook yet, read chapter 4. I had to think about it. Yep. Chapter 4, or just even skim through the first part of the book of Exodus, all the way up to the book of Exodus until they walk through the Red Sea, and just begin to look for God dismantling worldview. Anything else we should say at the end?
I think this would be a great week for another bonus episode. And on that episode, we'll ask people to participate in a quiz on all of the plagues, the names of the gods that you mentioned. There's a lot of info that you just went through in all of that.
Yeah. And just to remember, God doesn't do anything, haphazard or by random. It was very specific. And again, for us, he's very specific. He knows what needs to be dismantled in our worldview.
Yeah, and normally when I think about the plagues, I never think about how God was revealing himself in there, but it's just so clear that through all of them, he was
teaching who he is.
Yeah.
So hopefully that's helpful for all of us. We say it every week. Growth always begins with the next step, and sometimes that next step is simply understanding. This was kind of an upper story, to use our language, upper story view of what God is doing. God was always at work, always involved, and always trying to draw us to him. So I hope that's helpful to you. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe, make sure you like, and we will see you next week for another episode.